Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Gentlemen for Cinephiles. I am so excited today. So we are doing the official second episode of our October series about spooky films, creepy films, all that stuff. Sorry if the audio is a little weird for the rest of the month. I decided for my own episodes that I'd use a single mic instead of the first audio setup, the full audio setup. So that's my reason. Those are my excuses. But yeah. So for all of you who tuned into the last episode, I just like to really shout out Alex again because he honestly reps the horror community so strongly. It's so interesting. I talk about this all the time and I know I talked about it with Alex, but I don't remember if I said it on the actual podcast episode. But the super interesting thing to me about the horror film community is that I'm an indie filmmaker and I'm not particularly like a genre filmmaker. I'm just kind of indie generally. But the horror film community is just so interwoven, so tight knit, and so just put together so well and so kind and nice and welcoming. And it's just so amazing to see how tight knit a community of filmmakers really can be. And I think it's so important. And, that's just tantamount and proven by, the response we had to the Terrifier episode and even getting like David Howard Thornton and everybody to share it. It was so nice and I really, really appreciate it. So, yes, moving into today's film. So for today, we are going to be discussing American Psycho. It is actually one of my favorite films of all time. It's like a very, I don't talk about it a ton, but it's a film that I think about a lot in relation to my work because it's directed by Mary Herron, I believe is her last name, and it's a female directed film, and it's kind of one of the big examples of a woman-led film that's an excellent film. It's just so well done throughout, and the lens it has on violence and sexuality, I think it's one of those films that proves women have a different look at violence and sexuality. I am still in my own studies of film and in my own personal filmmaking journey. I'm trying to figure out how to verbalize what that means. But I think when you watch cinema directed by men, with a male gaze, not saying it's bad, it's just completely different than a female gaze. And I think American Psycho adds a lot to the conversation when it comes to violence and sexuality because um because it just does such an excellent job at going there, right? Okay, so American Psycho, it is about a New York, Wall Street guy named Patrick Bateman, and it's really interesting the way it frames a critique of this kind of upper class lifestyle because we saw a pretty big sociopath push in everyday society and with social media and everything like that about a year ago, and I think that American Psycho strongly indulged in that way before now we're kind of seeing a resurgence of those same kind of ideas. So American Psycho just kind of tracks through this man who has a very, by all means, vapid lifestyle. All that really matters is his routine, trendy restaurants, keeping up appearances, having the best car, having the best house, having the best business card, all that stuff. The intriguing thing about American Psycho is the way you really get to delve into the psychology of Patrick Bateman and the killer. There's, just the way that narration is sieved within the narrative, I think is a very effective use of narration. Generally speaking, when you're looking at narration in film is a very show don't tell medium. Narration, it more often than not takes away from the filmic experience in my, just in my study of film personally, and what I've seen and how I've seen narration be used is kind of like a crutch, if you will. But American Psycho, the way it uses and utilizes the narration and utilizes Patrick Bateman, discussing through with himself, it does a very intriguing job at showcasing his lifestyle, and it showcases, the kind of twisted perspective that we're working with because, with the whole idea of this sociopath, operating within society, it's very interesting to get him walking through all of everything about his life and how, he kills people and what he thinks about that, what he thinks about the women in his life, what he thinks about the people in his life. It's just so intriguing, and it adds a really large amount of depth to the film because for a killer like this where, not a lot of us can really relate to a sociopath because not a lot of us experience society and experience not a lot of us experience society on that level. So being able to directly be put into that same position and to kind of be super high on the hierarchy of knowledge to where we're equivalent with Patrick Bateman, it's very intriguing. And then also in another way, the film is also framed very interesting because you also don't get a lot of films that frame um, the experience, especially horror films that frame the entire experience through the eyes of the killer, it's generally speaking through like a third party lens, a fly on the wall, through the eyes of a victim or through the eyes of somebody who's fighting the perpetrator. You don't necessarily get it through the perpetrator's eyes and through the perpetrator's lens. You get glimpses into their psychology in a lot of horror films, but you don't get a full-on look at a person. So, yes, I just like to talk about a couple different scenes. So, one of the scenes that is my favorite in American Psycho is the business card scene, and it is so fascinating to me. And it's, you know, it's one of the biggest scenes in the film, honestly. It's one of the ones that I see people, you know, talk about a lot. So everyone is sitting around a table and they're all flaunting their business cards, and it really it's a strong point in the movie because it really just showcases how vapid the lifestyle is, you know. There are particular details about the business cards. They all are pretty much variations of the exact same thing with a, you know, a couple nuances, I suppose, if you want to get technical, but seeing how poorly Patrick Bateman reacts to not being the superior person or the alpha male is so fascinating. And you know, his breakdown of self that occurs when he doesn't meet this standard, you know, that is honestly just perpetuated in his own head and nothing that really means anything. And it's so fascinating because then, you know, his coworker Paul, he is seen as superior with the business cards in Patrick Bateman's eyes. And so then he gets him drunk and goes back to his apartment. And then you get the hip to be square monologue, and then he kills Paul. And it's just so fascinating how, you know, it's interesting as a meta commentary because I feel like there's a lot of this now in society, not necessarily people killing other people because they feel like blah, 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 blah. But this whole competition angle, like I always say that in film, you're able to explore everyday things by going to the absolute extreme. And I think that's, you know, tantamount with American Psycho in this particular sequence because you have this very intriguing, very vapid display of, you know, this vapid display of vanity and competition that's put between these two men. You know, whose business card is better, even though they're literally the exact same thing and it doesn't matter. Then you have, you know, somebody reacting so badly to that and so badly to being perceived as a non-superior person that they have to actually exert violence and just completely remove, you know, the other individual from the situation and the scenario. And it's so fascinating to me because I feel like that extreme teaches us a lot about how things don't really matter and competition is a vapid thing and competition really doesn't exist, but it's acted out in very toxic ways within our society, you know, and I love that about American Psycho. I think it does a great job at going to the extreme to showcase, you know, the everyday, you know, or, you know, it does a great job at going to the extreme to showcase stuff that can be applied to everyday life. You have this man who, by all means, checks all the boxes. You know what I mean? He's very attractive. He's very smart. He's very, you know, he's a really good job. He's very wealthy, X, Y, and Z, you know. He checks all these boxes. However, at the same time, his actual marriage is like a completely lifeless, like loveless situation. But then not only there's that, there's also the angle of the only people he has sex with are prostitutes who he's paying and who are kind of indulging in his fantasy until it's all broken down and then they have to leave. You know what I mean? They get paid and they leave. It's very weird to say, but I've been with men who act like Patrick Bateman in terms of, you know, sexual situations. And it just really touches on how effective I see the movie as because of these personal experiences I've had. It's always, you know, insecure men who see themselves as unsuperior, unworthy, unmanly, X, Y, and Z. They act exactly like that in sexual situations and in exploitative scenarios because and it's just such an effective commentary on that type of man and how, you know, you can put on that you feel all these ways about yourself. You feel like you're wealthy, you feel like you're a catch, you feel like you blah 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 blah. Because but at the same time, you can't quite hide from the fact that you feel unsuperior, and that's why you're acting out in all of these ways that are perceived to be toxic. You know what I mean? Particularly speaking, the like, you know, having sex with a woman and then watching yourself in the mirror, like that's something I've experienced with men, and so it's so interesting that when it's a woman-directed film, she takes this very toxic man, and she takes this man who's, I think the way American Psycho sets it up, it's just this man who's a creation of the world he's living in. He's not necessarily an entity all by himself. You know, if we're looking at like the tabula rasa of an individual and how society shapes that person, and society, you know, fills the blank page that teaches us how to feel, how to think, how to act as, you know, men, as women, blah 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 blah. Bateman just seems to be a victim of the society he lives in, and when he can't meet those, you know, impossible standards set upon him, he acts out in very toxic ways because he feels superior, because he hasn't realized that, you know, the caveat to society is that there nothing really matters and nobody really has an answer and nobody really controls who is and isn't superior, blah 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 blah. All of that stuff within society is an illusion, and Bateman hasn't realized that. Even so, he continues to perpetuate this ideal within society that he's never going to reach, and so it comes out in toxic ways. And so seeing a woman take that and make the sexuality angle be so realistic to all these men, to and make it so realistic in a way that is very reflective of how actual men act in society, is so fascinating to me, because it's so interesting, and I think it's something that only a woman could really do with a male character like this, you know what I mean? Unless you have somebody who is a male who's very, very reflective on, and very, very like self-reflective on male identity and how that's, you know, kind of perpetuated in society. I just think that women have a completely different angle on way how toxic manhood, you know, not to use like a term that's overused and used for, you know, all over the place. But I think a woman has a really, really good lens on what it looks like when manhood comes out as toxic. And that comes out very strongly in American Psycho, which is something I particularly really, really appreciate about the film, and I think is a very high point about the film. I also think that it's very fascinating in a lot of ways too that Evelyn, the character played by Reese Witherspoon, is kind of the only woman who really makes it out alive in this situation, because it's super fascinating to me. She's kind of the only woman who doesn't give Bateman what he wants and doesn't indulge in Bateman's fantasy, right? And it's hilarious because she comes out unscathed at the end. Yeah, he breaks off the engagement with her, but at the same time, he's not the person in power in the relationship, and therefore Evelyn comes out alive as a very interesting twist on, you know, who's in power in the situation. And it really indulges in this kind of setup the narrative has that leads to the end of it. The end of it kind of feels a little like Goodfellas in that it's a very non-cathartic-ish kind of ending. So, you know, the way the narrative kind of ends at the end with this kind of twist of it maybe all happened in his head, this confession meant nothing, blah 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 blah, trying to talk through how he killed everybody. It's very interesting too, because then it takes a step back and it puts it all in Bateman's head, or you know, could put it all in Bateman's head. That's a particular reading you could have of the film. And, you know, with that reading of the film, it indulges even stronger in this kind of being a slave to the society that you're put in when you don't realize the nuance to the society you're put in. When you don't realize how you can kind of go around and, you know, utilize the nuances of society to your advantage. It's very interesting, especially people in these privileged situations like Bateman. You know, he's a white male Wall Street banker. You know, he's at peak privilege from what we see in our own society, but at the same time, he's still suffering in the same way under all these societal expectations as another individual would be. He just in a different kind of way, because he's on a different kind of level, different kind of societal level. He's not this, you know, suave killer, blah, 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 who's killed all these people and gotten away with it, intelligent being. Instead, he's a humanized being, and he's suddenly, you know, he's taken from it really almost destroys his own sense of self, because what he has a godlike perception on himself to the point where it turns into illusions of grandeur, and then that's taken down a peg by, you know, having all of that called into question and having all of that possibly crumble by the end of the narrative. It's very fascinating, because then the true horror of the film comes at this individual thinking that he's better than he is, and then that whole ideal crumbling in front of his eyes. It's just so fascinating, because like it plays into why there's no catharsis. It's not that there's no catharsis because he doesn't get punished by his crime for his crimes. Rather, it could no catharsis because he didn't even commit any crimes to begin with, I guess, from my own viewing of the film and my own lens on it. That's the real horrifying thing. It's, you know, to compare it to Goodfellas once more, like Goodfellas, the horror of the film comes from, and like the true existential dread of the film comes from, it's not that Henry, left all of these men and like, blah blah blah, sold them all out, blah blah blah. It's the fact that he has to go to a mediocre life and live in that, his own perceived mediocrity, you know. Looking back at American Psycho, there's kind of the same come around at the end where he, you think you're great, you think you're this amazing, intelligent person who can get away with everything and blah, 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 blah. And then the existential dread that you have to live with and the karma that's equivalent to that becomes, you breaking that down and you having to live this mediocre life that you didn't think you were living, but you realize that you really are. It's when it's that terrible moment where you realize the illusion of everything in life way too late. And so that's a really, really fascinating thing about American Psycho that always really stood out to me. So it even plays with the spectator in a really, really interesting way, because the spectator is set up in this way that's like, oh, I know everything Patrick Bateman is doing. I know everything that's going on. I know what's going to happen to this person, blah, 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 blah. I'm seeing him kind of break down at the end, but like, whatever, blah, 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 that's fine. But then when you get to the end and you find out that Bateman didn't know everything and that there's a twist that Bateman possibly didn't commit anything that he said he did, or anything that you've been watching the entire time, and you're also taken out of that, it creates a very like interesting relationship to the hierarchy of knowledge, because it makes it seem as if you knew more than you did. So then when it pulls back, you're like questioning yourself as a viewer, and it's like, wait a minute, what? And it's very interesting to rewatch the film too, because then when you're rewatching the film, you're wondering, was there something I mistaked? Was there something I saw that like could have led me to believe this? Is this like a Memento? Is this like a Fight Club where I could kind of like figure out through a second viewing, that this, twist at the end happened like throughout? But you're so in Bateman's head throughout the movie, and it's such an excellent, directorial decision to do this, that when you rewatch the film, you realize, no, you're right there with Bateman, where you think he did all the stuff he did until the twist is revealed at the end. You're going along with Bateman, and you find out at the same moment as him that he is just this highly mediocre person, and it's so fascinating, and I love that. And it's interesting paired with the very physical violence that happens, chopping up bodies, nail gun, like shooting people, axe murdering your coworker to death. Those traditional elements of the horror genre very strongly juxtaposed with something that like gets me a little bit more, which is existential horror. In the way it blends both together, it's just perfectly well done, and I love American Psycho. So, yes, that is American Psycho. It's an excellent film. I highly recommend it. I think it's an excellent horror film. So there's a novel, I believe it's also American Psycho, and we were actually, in a couple days, we'll be talking about the horror film, the horror film. We'll be talking about the horror film American Psycho 2, but also like the horror story that was the making of American Psycho 2, because it's just so fascinating. It has literally nothing to do with American Psycho except for, a couple things they added later on, but I'm very excited to talk about that. Yes, so tomorrow you can catch us for a episode about Midsommar, a Ari Aster, I believe, a horror film that just came out, and it's excellent. But yes, so you'll catch me that tomorrow. There's some more horror stuff coming up this week, and yes, thank you all so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Bye!